The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
Coming up, but certainly you can imagine, people's focus are on trying to feed their families and not necessarily worrying about what's going on with Reconstruction. Years have passed since the Civil War ended, and yet the South is what they would have said in using the language of that time. They would have said the South is unrepentant, so they're not sorry for the sins that they committed against the Union. So, Northern public is really tired of the South's inability to really atone for what they had done starting the Civil War. So the North is just tired of the resistance going on in the South, and white Southerners trying to keep society as much as possible like it had been. So in the end, that's one reason. Republicans also retreat from Reconstruction due to the political problems in the Grant administration. There's political corruption associated not with President Grant personally. He was an extremely honest person, but members of his cabinet and high officials in his government, which was, of course, bad press for the president. Grant, of course, personally very responsible and honest. Great story about the president driving his carriage down Pennsylvania Avenue one day and at a high rate of speed, and he gets pulled over by the police. So if you think that's something new, it's not. And the officer tells the president, sees that it's the president, and says, "Oh, that's okay, sir, I know you're busy." And he's like, "No, I was wrong. I should have been going slower. You should give me a ticket. Thank you so much." Sorry about that. All right, so whoever needs, this is 15, and this is 16. We'll just sort of pass them back and forth across the back two rows. Make sure everyone gets them. But anyway, that's an interesting, just kind of side note about President Grant's character, that he insisted on getting the ticket. I would not have been, I don't think, so honest. I'm like, thank God, don't give me a ticket. So, anyway, some believe, which of course it is in general true, that the goals of Reconstruction are met. All the new amendments to the Constitution were ratified by the Southern states.
Did everybody get? I'm so sorry. Did everybody get Chapter 16? Yeah.
Everyone's good now. Thank you for taking care of it. It was true. All the amendments to the Constitution are passed by the Southern states, and African Americans did have the ability to vote, at least in theory, everywhere. Of course, we know that the Ku Klux Klan tried to prevent that. So that's another reason. And then just because of all the political strife, the corruption going on with the government, although of course there's corruption throughout government. Voting corruption is rampant in this country at that time. Sometimes politicians and talking heads give their opinion on cable news nowadays. And they're trying to make everyone believe that there's all kinds of political, like voting corruption nowadays. And there's not. I mean, all the statistics show that there's not. But at this time in history, there really was. So that's certainly a major issue. And then mismanagement of Reconstruction. Of course, the Freedmen's Bureau ceases to exist in 1872, 5 years before Reconstruction even ends. So there's a big hole in Reconstruction with no major entity other than the military overseeing Reconstruction as well. So anyway, all these problems will lead to people really favoring an end, unless people in the North, of course, favoring an end to Reconstruction. The white South, of course, had favored an end to Reconstruction back in 1865. They would have been happy for it to be over. But the final straw that leads to the end of Reconstruction is the election of 1876, when there's no clear winner. Samuel Tilden of New York wins the popular vote, but he doesn't win the electoral vote. Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio obviously loses the popular vote, but he doesn't win the electoral vote. So, and of course we know in modern times that this has happened where you can not win the popular vote. It happened in the 2000 election, and it happened in the 2016 election. But in those cases, you can win, as long as you win electoral college, it doesn't matter, and that's happened throughout history. But in this case, there's no clear winner, because you have to have, depending on the period of time, and there'll be a certain number of electoral votes that you have to have. And neither candidate had those, so, which created a constitutional crisis. I mean, it has happened in the past. It happened when Jefferson ran back in the election of 1800. So there is precedent for this. It happened when John Quincy Adams ran in the election of 1824. But in those cases, the House of Representatives did what the Constitution said, that they would vote on who they thought should be the winners. What they would do is take the top 3 candidates, the top 3 with the most votes, and then the House of Representatives would vote. In this case, in 1876, the House of Representatives decided, I don't know exactly why, but they decided they would form a committee instead, and they would let the committee make the decision. And it was supposed to be made up of equal members of Republicans, equal members of Democrats, and then an independent who would be the tiebreaker. But the independent person resigned from the committee, and the Republicans who were in control of the House of Representatives put another Republican in his place, and in that situation, what happened? Obviously, the deck was already stacked for Hayes. Hayes was going to win. It was just a matter of convincing the Democrats to go along with it and not cause some type of huge problem politically and constitutionally, to at least accept it. So actually the committee didn't make a formal decision until very, very late, until March, just before the inauguration was to take place. So you had November, December, January, and February, where there's no legitimate person that's going to become president of the United States yet. So that's a really tense time. The committee is working on negotiations at that time of trying to get the South to agree, at least in theory. And what happens is they come up with what was known as a secret plan. A secret plan that we know as the compromise of 1877. And so the secret agreement, compromise of 1877, says that Reconstruction will end, and federal troops will be removed from the last 3 states that are being occupied by the federal armies: Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida. Those are the states, of course, where you've had these disputed votes. The disputed votes come about because you have separate, basically what you had was, you can have these shadow governments that were going on during Reconstruction. Did I mention shadow governments at all?
Yeah.
I did, okay, so that was a problem. So you had separate ballot boxes. Congress will also agree that it will invest in the Southern economy. And essentially the way it invested in the Southern economy, the major way it did, was it agreed to build a southern route to the Transcontinental Railroad. southern route that had been actually planned for many decades but never built. So as to link, of course, Atlanta, the major city of the South, with the West coast, and that was very important. Now, the South's economy doesn't necessarily recover, even with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, with the influx of some industry into the South. Cotton textile mills were actually built in the South in the last decades of the 19th century. Often manufacturers from New England states, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, which were big producers of cloth. Sometimes those companies would decide to just pick up and move to a southern state that was producing a lot of cotton. It made a lot of sense. You didn't have to worry about shipping costs that would add to the cost of your finished product. And so you didn't have to transport the raw cotton up north. You could just make the textiles in right there, right wherever the cotton was being grown. But that didn't really lead to growth in the South becoming an urban society. The South, for the most part, continued to be very rural, based on agriculture, based on cotton, and so their economy suffered. Their tax base was always low because of this belief in limited government and low taxes, but what that meant was even with, of course, constitutionally, in the state constitutions, all southern states were required to establish public schools for all children of all colors. But what that meant was, with the segregated society that grew out of that, it meant that each state had to build 2 schools. So schools had to be built for white people and black people, and it meant that they were spending money needlessly on separate buildings and then separate teachers. Of course, the African American students were the ones who suffered more because they tended to get the least desirable buildings and not enough materials, not enough supplies that were going to the black schools as opposed to the white schools. But the white children weren't getting the education that they should have gotten either because money had to be divided. And so there's all these problems that the South ends up with for basically, decades into the future because of the society that grew out of going backwards with Reconstruction. So anyway, there's the map. So you have the segregated society that's created. Now, all the gains of Reconstruction don't immediately evaporate. All African Americans don't just immediately stop voting in April of 1877 when Reconstruction ends, but gradually, town by town, county by county, state by state, over the course of the late 1870s, throughout the 1880s, what you find in those states, southern states, is that they gradually erode the civil rights of the black community in their states. Violence, intimidation, and lynching were common ways that African Americans were forced to accept the environment in which they lived. There were no longer federal troops stationed in the South to ensure that civil rights were being granted. No longer did the President of the United States send in troops to put down the Klan. No longer did governors, with the elimination of the Republican Party, essentially again in the South. No longer did a Republican governor send in the state troops to put down the Klan, and so you have a really terrible situation that would then continue for decades into the future, until finally in the 1950s and 60s, the civil rights movement would start to bring about change. And then we'll get to that at the end of the semester. Fascinating period in history. And even then, the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, the great-great-grandchildren of the people that were doing this were unwilling to change. So. All right. So we'll move on to westward expansion. So the other day I mentioned Horace Greeley, and Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, who ran for the presidency against Grant in 1872, and he was famous for the saying, "Go west, young man." And of course, this was an ideal in America for generations. Really going back to the earliest point of settlement, there was always going to be new land if you went west. So, going back to the time of the Pilgrims, there's always the forest behind you that if you need to create another field, you can just go cut down some more trees, set up your kids on their own farm. And so this was the American dream for hundreds of years. And in the 19th century, those really remote lands of the interior of the American continent can be accessed because of the technology of the steam locomotive, which meant that as long as you could build the track, as long as you could have water and fuel, meaning wood or coal, that you could bring a locomotive and people and goods across great distances, and people could settle in these remote areas that had never been accessible to the already established areas of this continent, or really of the world, because what's happening here in the United States in the 19th century is happening around the globe. It's happening in Africa. Africa was an early place that was colonized by European nations, just like North America was. European nations could only colonize coastal regions of Africa because it's a massive continent, and the interior was so remote and inaccessible that it was impossible to get to until the 19th century. It's happening in places like South America as well. So all these remote interiors of continents are now being accessed, and the rich content of their natural resources are being extracted, but obviously to the detriment of the indigenous people that live there. And it's not just the American Indians here in North America, it's happening to the African nations as well. So I just want you to keep in mind what's going on, in kind of a context of a world context. So here in the United States, that idea that there's always land in the West that can be settled. Certainly if most people did not settle in really remote areas. Up to the Mississippi is great. A little bit past the Mississippi is fine, because as long as you have access to a natural waterway, then you can still be in communication with larger towns and cities. You can send your crops, like if you live, say, along the Mississippi, you can send your crops down to New Orleans, where there's a lot of people living, or out to ports around the world, because New Orleans is a large port. With the canal systems that were built in the early part of the 19th century, there's a canal linking Chicago and Lake Michigan through the Great Lakes, and then of course the Erie Canal that links the Atlantic Ocean with the Great Lakes. So that was an important part of the transportation network that opened up large areas of the interior of the continent in the 19th century as well. But it's really the locomotive that really allows for people to live.
Good luck with today's lesson.